standing in front of the mirror inside the roadside restroom. I barely recognized the man staring back at me. My face looked tired, worn down by something deeper than the long drive that had brought me here. For a moment, I simply stood there, staring into my own reflection as if I expected it to give me answers. But the mirror stayed silent. I took a slow breath and stepped outside. The cold air greeted me immediately, carrying the damp scent of the lake nearby. Beyond the railing, Toluca Lake stretched out into the distance, completely swallowed by fog. The water and the sky blended together into one endless pale gray horizon. Somewhere out there, hidden beneath that fog, was the town of Silent Hill. I reached into my jacket and unfolded the letter once more. The paper was worn from how many times I had already read it. The handwriting was unmistakable. Mary's handwriting. My dearest James, I'm waiting for you in our special place, in Silent Hill. The words still felt impossible. Mary had died 3 years ago. I knew that. I had been there when it happened. And yet, the letter was real, resting in my hands, as if it had always belonged there. Dead people don't write letters. At least, that's what I had always believed. Still, the possibility lingered in the back of my mind, a small, irrational hope that refused to disappear. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe someone was playing a cruel trick on me. Or maybe, somehow, Mary really was waiting in Silent Hill. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into my pocket. If there was even the smallest chance that it was real, I had to follow it. I walked toward my car and grabbed the map of Silent Hill from inside. The town layout spread across the paper like a maze of quiet streets and landmarks. Somewhere on that map was the place Mary had meant. Our special place. I stepped away from the car and followed the road to the left. The fog drifted slowly across the pavement, and the trees along the roadside swayed quietly in the wind. Ahead of me, I spotted a stairway near a white van parked beside the road. I descended the steps and found myself standing on a narrow dirt path leading into the forest. The moment I stepped onto the trail, the world behind me seemed to disappear. The road faded away, leaving only the soft crunch of dirt beneath my shoes and the quiet rustling of branches overhead. The path stretched forward through the trees, winding slowly downhill. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear faint sounds echoing through the forest. Low, animalistic noises that sounded like a pack of dogs moving somewhere beyond the trees. The sounds made me uneasy, but they stayed far enough away that I continued forward. The trail seemed to go on forever, twisting gently through the forest as the fog thickened around the trees. Eventually, I saw a rusted iron gate standing ahead of me. I pushed it open and stepped through. Beyond the gate, the path continued for a short distance before opening into a small cemetery. Weathered gravestones stood scattered across the ground, their surfaces worn smooth by time and rain. The fog drifted lazily between them, giving the place a quiet, almost forgotten feeling. That's when I noticed someone standing near one of the graves, a young woman. She turned slightly as I approached, her expression cautious but not frightened. "Excuse me," I said. "Can you tell me how to get to Silent Hill?" She studied me for a moment before answering. "There's only one road that goes there," she said. "Wiltsea Road." Her voice was quiet, almost uncertain. "But it might be hard to see in this fog." Then her expression changed slightly, as if she suddenly realized something. "You shouldn't go there," she added. "Silent Hill is strange." I frowned slightly. "Strange?" She hesitated, as if trying to find the right words. "I don't know. There's just something wrong with it." She looked at me carefully. "Why would you want to go there?" I hesitated for a moment before answering. "I'm looking for someone very important to me." The woman seemed to understand that answer. "I'm looking for someone too," she said quietly. "My mother." She glanced around the cemetery. "I thought maybe my father and brother might be here. That's why I came." We stood there in silence for a moment as the fog moved slowly between the gravestones. "My name is Angela," she finally said. "Angela Orozco." I introduced myself as well. Angela stepped slightly aside and pointed toward the far end of the cemetery. "The road continues that way," she said. "If you follow the path, it should eventually lead you to Wiltsey Road." Before I left, she looked at me again with the same uneasy expression as before. "You really shouldn't go to Silent Hill," she repeated softly. But I had already made my decision. I nodded politely and continued walking through the cemetery. Near the edge of the grounds, I passed a small house, standing quietly among the graves. I circled around the right side of it until I found a gate built into the stone wall. On the other side, the path continued again, narrow and winding as it followed the hillside downward. The road twisted through the forest, passing an abandoned car sitting silently beside the trail. Further ahead, a pile of cut logs rested along the right side of the path, near an old sign marking the nearby ranch land. The further I walked, the quieter the world became. Eventually, the dirt trail came to an end, at another gate. I pushed it open and stepped through. On the other side was Wiltsey Road. The road stretched forward into the fog, leading directly toward Silent Hill. Somewhere beyond the mist, the town waited. And somewhere inside that town was the answer to Mary's letter. After leaving the cemetery behind, I followed the narrow path Angela had pointed out. The trail wound through the trees, quiet except for the sound of my footsteps pressing into the dirt. The fog drifted slowly between the trunks, thick enough to blur the distance. The deeper I walked, the more the forest seemed to swallow the world behind me. The road eventually opened into the outskirts of Silent Hill, where the dirt trail met the pavement of Sanders Street. The town looked nothing like the peaceful place I remembered visiting with Mary years ago. Buildings stood silent on both sides of the road, their windows dark and empty. The fog rolled through the streets like a living thing, swallowing corners and alleyways until the entire town felt like it existed inside a dream. I unfolded the map from my pocket and tried to get my bearings. This part of town was the southeastern section of Silent Hill, where Wiltsey Road connected with the streets inside the city. Somewhere to the northwest was Toluca Lake and Rosewater Park. If Mary had written that she was waiting in our special place, the lake was the first place I needed to check. Across the street from where I stood was a small flower shop. The door creaked slightly in the wind as I stepped inside. The shop had clearly been abandoned. Dust covered the counters, and the plants had long since withered. On a gardening table near the back, I found a small first aid kit someone had left behind. I slipped it into my jacket before stepping back into the fog-covered street. I began walking west, along Sanders Street, until I reached the intersection with Lindsay Street. That was when I noticed something strange on the pavement. Blood. Dark stains smeared across the asphalt, forming a trail that led north along Lindsay Street. I crouched slightly, studying the marks. Whatever had left that trail had been injured or dragged. As I lifted my head, something moved through the fog further down the street. A shape, just a silhouette for a moment before it vanished into the mist. At first I thought it might be another person, someone hurt, someone who needed help. Without thinking much about it, I decided to follow the direction the figure had taken. Before heading north, I noticed a small stairway near the intersection and found a bottle of medicine lying nearby. I picked it up and continued along Lindsay Street, keeping my eyes on the blood trail. The fog grew thicker as I moved deeper into the street. Every building looked deserted, the doors closed and the windows dark. The town felt empty, but not peaceful. It felt like something was wrong beneath the silence. A little further down the road, I found another bottle of medicine near the door of a garage just before the road curved toward Vax Road. The blood trail continued ahead, guiding me forward. At one point, I tried turning left toward Cat Street, but bright yellow police tape blocked the path completely. Someone had sealed off the street with warning tape, the strips fluttering weakly in the cold wind. I stood there for a moment staring at it before turning back toward Lindsay Street. Whatever I had seen earlier hadn't gone that way. I continued north until I reached a point where the road had collapsed entirely. The pavement ended abruptly in a broken drop that prevented me from reaching Nathan Avenue. A bottle of medicine sat near a door just before the edge of the collapse. I picked it up before turning back again. It seemed the only way forward was east. I followed Vax Road, where the blood trail reappeared on the pavement. The stains led me further east until the street opened into a fenced area surrounded by metal bars. The gate stood slightly open. Inside, I found a small enclosed space where someone had apparently taken shelter before. A bench sat against the wall beside a strange red symbol carved into the surface, a save point. 2 bottles of medicine had been left nearby as well. I took them before stepping back through the gate and continuing east along the road. Eventually, the street ended at a tunnel entrance that had been sealed shut with wooden boards. As I approached, a strange sound caught my attention. Static. A faint crackling noise came from somewhere near the barricade. I squeezed between the loose boards to investigate. On the ground sat a small, portable radio. It was old and covered in dust, but it was still working. The speaker hissed with bursts of interference that rose and fell unpredictably. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. That was when something moved beside me. I turned slowly. A figure was emerging from the fog just a few steps away. At first it looked human, but the closer it came, the more twisted its shape appeared. Its body was wrapped tightly in something that looked like pale skin or fabric stretched across its limbs. The creature staggered forward with slow, unnatural movements, dragging its feet across the pavement. That was the moment I finally understood what Angela had meant when she called Silent Hill a strange place. The creature suddenly expelled a stream of burning liquid from an opening in its chest. The acid hissed as it struck the ground where I had been standing seconds earlier. Instinctively, I grabbed one of the loose wooden boards from the barricade and held it like a weapon. The monster lurched toward me again, but I circled around it, striking from the side. The creature staggered and turned awkwardly, trying to face me. I struck it again with the plank, and again. Eventually, it collapsed onto the pavement, twitching briefly before going still. The radio in my hand erupted with louder static as the creature died. I stood there breathing heavily, staring at the motionless body. My hands trembled slightly as I lowered the wooden plank. Monsters. That was the only explanation that made sense. The radio crackled again in my hand. At first it sounded like the same interference as before. But then, something else slipped through the noise, a faint voice buried beneath the static. "James." I froze. For a moment I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but the sound had been unmistakable. My name, spoken softly through the radio. Mary's voice echoed in my memory so clearly that it made my chest tighten. I stared down at the radio, my heart pounding. Mary had died 3 years ago, and yet hearing my name like that made the impossible thought return again. What if she really was somewhere in this town? The static slowly faded until the radio fell silent again. I clipped it to my belt, realizing it might warn me if another one of those creatures came close. When I returned to the intersection of Lindsay and Cat Street, something had changed. The yellow police tape that had blocked the road earlier had been cut. The strips now hung loosely from the posts, swaying gently in the wind. I stared at the broken tape for a moment, wondering who could have done it. I hadn't seen anyone else in the town. but the path was open now. I stepped onto Cat Street and began heading west through the fog. Somewhere beyond the maze of streets was Rosewater Park, near Toluca Lake. If Mary had written that she was waiting in our special place, that was where I needed to go. But the deeper I walked into Silent Hill, the more I felt that the town itself was slowly guiding me somewhere else first. The entrance door of the Woodside Apartments creaked as I stepped inside. The building felt abandoned the moment I crossed the threshold. The air was thick with dust, and the faint echo of my footsteps bounced off the cracked walls of the lobby. To my left, a map of the apartment building hung on the wall. I studied it briefly and memorized the layout before moving on. Near the staircase, I found a bottle of medicine someone had left behind. The door leading deeper into the first floor was locked, leaving me with only one option. I climbed the staircase and pushed through the door that led to the second-floor corridor. The hallway was dim and silent. I turned to the right and moved east along the corridor, keeping my distance from one of the twisted creatures wandering nearby. I slipped into apartment 205 to avoid it. Inside the room, something caught my attention immediately. A faint beam of light glowed from the direction of a mannequin standing near the wall. When I approached it, I realized the light was coming from a flashlight resting beside it. I picked it up and clipped it to my chest. The beam cut through the darkness of the apartment instantly. The moment I turned to leave, something moved in the shadows behind me. A creature rose slowly from the floor near the back of the room. A mannequin-like monster with limbs twisted at unnatural angles. Fortunately, it stood far from the door. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I stepped out of the apartment and closed the door behind me. With the flashlight now lighting my way, navigating the building became much easier. I explored several nearby rooms, collecting whatever supplies I could find. But something else was on my mind. The wooden plank I carried no longer felt like enough protection in a place like this. If monsters were roaming these apartments, I needed something better. I located the staircase on the western side of the building and climbed up to the third floor. When I stepped through the door, a metal barrier immediately caught my attention. On the other side of the bars, a key lay on the floor just out of reach. I knelt down and reached through the gap in the metal, stretching my fingers as far as they would go. I could almost touch it. Just as my fingertips brushed the cold surface of the key, a sudden sharp pain shot through my hand. Someone had stomped on it. I pulled my hand back instantly. A young girl stood on the other side of the bars, staring down at me with a strange expression. Without saying a word, she kicked the key further down the hallway where I couldn't reach it. Then she disappeared from view as quickly as she had appeared. I rubbed my hand and stood up slowly, irritated and confused. I had no idea who she was or why she had done that. There was nothing else accessible on that side of the floor, so I checked the map and made my way to apartment 301. Inside, a rusted shopping cart stood in the middle of the room. Among the scattered debris inside it, I found something that immediately changed the situation. A handgun. I picked it up carefully, feeling the weight of the weapon in my hands. Finally, something more reliable than a piece of wood. Still, I decided to keep the pistol as a last resort. Ammunition might not be easy to find in a place like this. I returned to the second floor and headed toward apartment 208. As I approached the door, the radio at my belt suddenly erupted with loud static. The noise grew stronger the closer I moved toward the end of the hallway. A metal barrier blocked the staircase ahead, but beyond the bars, I could see something standing in the shadows. A tall shape, watching silently from the other side. I stepped into apartment 208. The television inside was still on, filling the room with flickering light. In the chair facing the screen sat a corpse, slumped lifelessly, as if someone had attacked him while he was watching TV. The sight made my stomach tighten. Who could have done something like that? On a nearby shelf, I found a key labeled Room 202. In the bedroom stood an old clock mounted on the wall, but I couldn't do anything with it yet. I left the apartment and headed straight for room 202. The moment I entered, I noticed something strange about the place. The apartment was filled with cages and glass containers. Butterflies fluttered slowly through the air, their wings catching the beam of my flashlight. Whoever had lived here had been obsessed with them. In the bedroom, a hole in the wall caught my attention. Thick green sludge dripped from the opening. When I looked closer, I could see something metallic buried deep inside. I forced my hand through the sticky mess and searched blindly until my fingers finally wrapped around the object. I pulled it out and wiped it off. A key. The clock key. I returned to apartment 208 and inserted the key into the clock mechanism. The glass cover came loose, allowing me to adjust the hands manually. A message carved into the side of the clock read, "The scars from the past shall remove the nail that stops time." Across the room, 3 names had been scratched into the wall: Henry, Mildred, and Scott. A note nearby explained the rest of the puzzle: 3 hands moving at different speeds, the fat one, the tall one, and the thin one. After studying the clues, I set the clock to the correct position. The mechanism clicked loudly. When I pushed the clock aside, a hidden hole in the wall appeared behind it. I crawled through and emerged inside apartment 209. After gathering a few supplies in the room, I continued exploring the building until I reached the 3rd floor again. In apartment 307, I witnessed something disturbing. 2 creatures were struggling violently inside the room, thrashing against each other like animals. I quickly hid inside a closet, watching through the wooden slats. The creature that finally killed the other was unmistakable. The same towering figure I had seen behind the bars earlier. The one with the massive triangular helmet. As the creature approached the closet, panic took over, and I fired my pistol through the door. The shots echoed through the room. But strangely, it didn't attack me. It simply turned and walked away. When the room finally fell quiet, I stepped out of the closet and found a key left behind. The courtyard key. Later, as I explored the hallway further, I finally reached the spot where the girl had kicked the earlier key away. This time, it was within reach. I picked it up quickly, the fire escape key, half expecting the girl to appear again. But the hallway remained empty. Eventually, I made my way down to the 1st floor and out into the courtyard area. There, I discovered a drained swimming pool with several of the creatures moving inside it. In the bottom of a baby stroller, I spotted something important: a coin. After carefully retrieving it, I continued exploring the apartments. In room 101, I heard the unmistakable sound of someone vomiting inside the bathroom. When I opened the door, I found a man leaning over the toilet, pale and shaken. His name was Eddie. He told me he had seen the monsters too and had run here to hide. Like me, he had only recently arrived in Silent Hill and had no idea what was happening. The encounter confirmed something I had been wondering for a while. I wasn't the only one trapped in this town. Eventually, I returned to the 2nd floor and unlocked a blue door marked Exit. But when I stepped through it, I discovered something unexpected. There was no real exit at all. Another building had been constructed almost directly beside Woodside Apartments. A narrow fire escape led toward a window in the neighboring structure. Blue Creek Apartments. If I wanted to keep moving forward, it seemed the only way out was through the next building. I climbed through the window from Woodside Apartments and landed inside another building. The room was silent, dim, and unfamiliar. I had entered a different complex, Blue Creek Apartments. The air here felt just as stale as the previous building, but the layout was different. I quickly realized I had come through the bedroom window of apartment 203. There was nothing useful in the bedroom itself, so I stepped into the bathroom. When I looked down into the toilet, something caught my eye beneath the dirty water. I hesitated for a moment. Then, with a deep breath, I reached inside and pulled out a soaked wallet. Inside the wallet was a small piece of paper covered in strange symbols and numbers. It looked like some kind of coded message. Back in the living room, I noticed a safe sitting against the wall. When I examined the code more carefully, it became clear the paper contained the combination. After carefully turning the dial according to the instructions, the safe clicked open. Inside, I found several boxes of handgun ammunition. Whoever had lived here must have been preparing for something. Before leaving the apartment, I searched the kitchen and found a small bottle of medicine sitting on the counter. I slipped it into my pocket before stepping out into the hallway. The corridor outside was quiet except for the faint echo of movement somewhere nearby. One of the twisted creatures shuffled in the distance, but I avoided it and headed toward the staircase. Near the stairs, I spotted a map lying on the floor. It showed the layout of the Blue Creek building. The structure had 3 floors marked on the map, but the upper level didn't appear accessible from where I was standing. I made my way down to the first floor. As I stepped into the hallway, I heard the faint fluttering of wings. A large, beetle-like insect crawled along the floor nearby. The creature skittered toward me before I quickly crushed it underfoot. Just beside the stairwell was a small laundry room. Inside, sitting on top of a washing machine, I found another first aid kit. With the map now memorized, I began exploring the apartments along the hallway until I reached room 109. Inside, I found a box of handgun ammunition resting on the couch. But something else drew my attention. A white door inside the living room. When I pushed it open, I found Angela, the same young woman I had met in the cemetery earlier. She stood near the window, looking even more distressed than before. Her eyes were wide, her voice shaky. It was clear the town was affecting her just as much as it was affecting me. I told her something I had been struggling to admit even to myself, that chasing after someone I knew was dead was probably madness. When she heard that my wife had died, Angela suddenly became frantic. She spoke about needing to find her mother and hurried out of the room. As she left, she forgot something on the table. A knife. I approached the table slowly and picked it up. The blade felt heavy in my hand. Beside it sat an old coin. I added the coin to the others I had already found. After leaving Angela's room, I continued exploring the building until I entered apartment 105. Inside was an old cabinet with several empty slots carved into its surface. 3 coins I had collected earlier seemed to fit perfectly there. A riddle carved into the cabinet described how they should be arranged. References to a silent one, an old one, and a serpent. After carefully placing the coins in the correct positions, something inside the cabinet clicked open. A key slid forward. The key to apartment 209. I made my way back upstairs to the 2nd floor and unlocked the door to room 209. The apartment looked empty at first, but when I stepped onto the balcony outside, I noticed it connected to the neighboring apartment. I climbed across and entered room 208. Inside, resting on a chair, was another box of handgun ammunition. On the bed, I found an envelope. Inside the envelope was a key, the stairway key. I left the apartment and headed toward the northern end of the hallway where the stairwell waited. As I pushed open the door, my stomach tightened instantly. The tall figure I had seen earlier stood there waiting, the creature with the massive triangular helmet. Pyramid head. There was nowhere to hide this time. When I tried to retreat, the door behind me slammed shut. The creature dragged its enormous blade across the flooded floor of the stairwell and began moving toward me. I fired my pistol, the shots echoing through the stairwell. The bullet slowed it down, but didn't seem to harm it. The monster continued advancing, its massive weapon scraping against the ground. I kept my distance, circling the room and firing whenever it came too close. For what felt like an eternity, the creature stalked me through the water. Then suddenly, A distant siren began to wail somewhere outside. Pyramid Head stopped. Without another glance in my direction, it turned and descended the stairs through the flooded passage below. As it moved through the doorway, the water began draining away. I stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, waiting to see if it would return. But the stairwell remained silent. Slowly, cautiously, I followed the path it had taken and stepped out of the building, hoping I wouldn't run into that thing again. When I finally stepped outside the Blue Creek apartments, the cold air of Silent Hill greeted me again. The fog hadn't lifted. If anything, it felt thicker than before, pressing against the buildings and streets like a heavy curtain that refused to move. For a moment I stood there, listening. The town was quiet, but not peaceful. Silent Hill never felt peaceful anymore. I walked down the stairs beside the building and into a narrow alley. The place smelled damp, like rust and stagnant water. As I moved forward, I noticed a small figure sitting on top of a wall ahead of me. The girl. I recognized her immediately, the same one who had stomped on my hand and kicked the key away earlier. The memory of that sharp pain almost made my hand ache again. She looked down at me with the same careless expression as before. I tried asking her questions, who she was, why she was here, but she answered with sarcasm, like everything I said amused her. That's when I noticed the envelope she was holding. A letter. I asked her where she got it, but she brushed the question aside, as if it were none of my business. Then she said something that made my chest tighten. She told me I didn't even like Mary. For a moment I couldn't speak. Before I could ask how she knew Mary's name, the girl jumped down from the wall and disappeared into the fog, leaving me standing alone in the alley. The question echoed in my mind as I continued walking. How could she possibly know about Mary? The alley eventually opened into the entrance of a park. I climbed the stairs slowly and stepped deeper inside. The fog drifted across the ground in slow waves, and the trees stood motionless around the empty paths. Somewhere nearby, I could hear water moving softly beneath a wooden bridge. I crossed it and continued along the path, the lake somewhere beyond the fog. Toluca Lake. Mary and I had once walked through a place like this together. For a moment, the memory felt close enough to touch. Then I saw someone standing ahead. A woman. My heart stopped. From the distance, she looked exactly like Mary. The same hair, the same posture, the same quiet presence. I walked toward her slowly, almost afraid that if I moved too quickly the image would disappear. When she turned around, my breath caught in my throat. She looked just like Mary. Not similar, not close, exactly the same. But when she spoke, something was different. Her voice carried a confidence Mary never had. There was a strange playfulness in the way she looked at me. She introduced herself as Maria and told me she had never heard the name Mary before. The answer should have brought relief. Instead, it only made everything feel more confusing. I told her about the letter and how my wife had supposedly written to me, even though she had been dead for 3 years. Maria listened quietly, studying my face as if trying to understand what kind of man would come to a town like this chasing a ghost. Then she asked something unexpected. Maybe your wife meant another special place. The question stirred a distant memory. The hotel. Years ago, Mary and I had stayed in a hotel by the lake during our trip to Silent Hill. But it had been so long that I couldn't even remember how to get there anymore. Maria smiled slightly and said she knew the way. Without hesitation, she decided to come with me. The two of us left the park together and made our way through the streets toward Nathan Avenue. Walking beside her felt strange. Every time I glanced in her direction, my mind struggled to accept what my eyes were seeing. She looked like Mary, but she wasn't Mary. As we moved through the empty streets, Silent Hill seemed to grow even quieter around us. The buildings stood like hollow shells in the fog, their windows dark and lifeless. Eventually, we reached an abandoned gas station along the road. A metallic sound caught my attention near an old car. Something had been driven into the side of the vehicle. When I pulled it free, the engine sputtered and died completely. The metal pipe felt heavy in my hands, solid and reliable. For the first time since entering Silent Hill, I felt like I had something that could actually protect me. Maria watched me with quiet curiosity as we continued walking west along Nathan Avenue. We passed the old Historical Society building, its shape barely visible through the fog. Beyond it lay the bridge that should have taken us toward the hotel. But when we reached the end of the road, my hope collapsed with it. The bridge was gone. The concrete ended abruptly where the structure had broken away into the water below. Someone else had apparently tried to cross before me. A body lay near the edge. Beside it, I found a small map with several places marked on it. One location stood out: Pete's Bolorama. If anyone else was still in this town, maybe they would be there. Maria and I turned back the way we came. As we walked, something strange happened. One of those mannequin creatures suddenly fell from somewhere above us and crashed onto the pavement nearby. I stopped for a moment, staring at the thing. In Silent Hill, even the sky could drop nightmares at your feet. Eventually, we reached the bowling alley. Inside, the smell of food and grease lingered in the air, strangely normal compared to the horrors outside. That's when I heard voices. One of them belonged to Eddie, the nervous man I had met earlier. The other voice belonged to the girl, Laura. By the time I reached the room, she had already disappeared again. Eddie sat there, eating pizza like nothing in the world was wrong. He told me the girl's name was Laura, and that he had only met her recently himself. But if Laura knew Mary's name, then she knew something. And I needed to find out what it was. Maria and I hurried outside again. She had tried chasing Laura, but the girl had slipped through a narrow opening between two buildings. The gap was far too small for me to pass through. When I asked if there was another way around, Maria pointed toward a nearby door. It was locked with 3 separate locks. For a moment, I thought the trail had ended. Then Maria reached into her clothes and casually produced the keys. I stared at them for a second. In Silent Hill, coincidences like that were beginning to feel less like accidents and more like the town itself was guiding us somewhere. Inside, we climbed a staircase and passed through a dim nightclub called Heaven's Night. The place was empty, silent except for the faint echo of our footsteps. On the other side, another staircase led us back out into the fog. We stepped onto Carroll Street, and that's when I saw her again. Laura. She ran straight into a large building at the end of the street. When I looked up at the sign above the entrance, a cold feeling settled in my chest. Brookhaven Hospital. If Laura had gone inside, then that was where we were going next. When Maria and I approached the entrance of Brookhaven Hospital, the building rose out of the fog like a dark memory that refused to fade. The front doors opened with a slow metallic sound as we stepped inside. The air smelled sterile and stale, like a place that had once tried very hard to be clean, but had long since given up. Near the entrance, I noticed a hospital map posted on a board. I studied it carefully. The corridors twisted through the building like a maze, and something about the place immediately made me uneasy. Hospitals were meant to heal people, but in Silent Hill, even places like this felt wrong. We moved toward the reception office. The room looked abandoned, papers scattered across the desk as if someone had left in a hurry. For a moment, the silence inside the hospital felt heavier than the fog outside. In a nearby room, I found a typed memo left beside an old machine. The words written there were unsettling, as if the doctor who wrote them had been slowly losing his grip on reality. He spoke about a strange illness that could affect anyone under the right circumstances. He described a place that existed somewhere between reality and imagination, a narrow space where a person could slip away from the world entirely. He wondered whether, what the patient saw there was truly just delusion. And in the end, he wrote something that lingered in my mind long after I finished reading. Maybe the patient was happier there. Maybe bringing him back to reality was the crueler choice. I left the room feeling disturbed by the tone of the message. Something about this hospital had clearly been wrong long before I ever arrived. As Maria and I moved deeper into the building, we climbed the stairs to the second floor. That was when we encountered them, the nurses. At first glance, they still looked human, dressed in the familiar white uniforms of hospital staff. But their movements were wrong, their bodies stiff and unnatural as they staggered toward us through the corridor. Their faces were hidden, their heads wrapped and distorted, as if their identities had been erased completely. And in their hands, they carried pieces of metal, pipe like crude weapons. The way they moved was both slow and sudden, as if something inside them forced their bodies forward without thought. The hospital corridors echoed with the sound of metal striking the walls as they advanced. After dealing with them, we continued searching the hospital rooms. Inside one locker room, I noticed something strange, resting among the shelves and cabinets. A bent needle hidden inside a stuffed toy. Whoever left it there had clearly not intended for it to be found easily. Nearby, another discovery caught my attention. A shotgun locked away in one of the lockers. Seeing a weapon like that inside a hospital raised more questions than answers. What kind of place needed something like that close at hand? I took it anyway. In Silent Hill, survival mattered more than explanations. In another locker room, I discovered a blood-stained coat hanging loosely inside one of the lockers. Searching its pocket revealed a small key. Every new object I found in this place seemed to suggest the same thing. Someone had been here before me. Someone who had moved through these same corridors, leaving clues behind. Maria followed me quietly as we continued exploring the building. Eventually, we unlocked a door leading into another section of the hospital. The rooms there looked like examination areas and medical offices, but they felt strangely abandoned, as if the doctors and patients had vanished overnight. In one room, I discovered a sheet of paper pressed beneath another page, the faint imprint of words still visible from the pressure of the writing. The message made little sense. Whoever wrote it sounded paranoid, convinced that some hidden force obeyed their commands like a servant. The writing ended with a string of numbers scribbled almost as an afterthought. The words themselves meant nothing to me, but the number felt important enough that I memorized it. As we moved further into the hospital, the building seemed to grow darker and more oppressive. Eventually, we reached another corridor filled with patient rooms. Maria suddenly slowed down. She looked pale, tired. She sat down on one of the beds and told me she needed to rest for a while. Something about her expression made me hesitate. Leaving her there felt wrong, but she insisted she would be fine. I promised I would come back soon and stepped out into the hallway again. The deeper I explored the hospital, the more the place felt like it was closing in around me. Eventually, I climbed the stairs to the roof. The wind moved slowly across the open space above the building, carrying the distant sound of metal somewhere below. Near the fence, I noticed a few sheets of paper scattered on the ground. They appeared to be pages from a diary. The words described several days spent inside the hospital. Rain falling endlessly outside the window. Medication that made the writer feel sick and confused. Doubts about whether escaping from pain was wrong, or whether it was simply the only way to survive it. The final entry ended with something strangely hopeful. The sun had come out. The doctors had said the patient could finally go home. I didn't know who had written those pages, but something about the quiet desperation in those words stayed with me as I turned back toward the door. When I tried to open it, the handle wouldn't move. The door had locked itself somehow. I stared at it in disbelief. The only other door on the roof led to the elevator control room, but that one was locked as well. I stood there trying to understand what was happening when I heard it, the sound of metal dragging slowly across the ground. I turned and saw him again. The towering figure with the triangular helmet stepped out from the shadows. The heavy blade in his hand scraped against the floor with every step. I barely had time to react before he rushed forward and slammed me violently into the metal fence surrounding the roof. The impact broke the railing behind me. For a brief moment, the world vanished beneath my feet. Then everything went black. When I regained consciousness, I realized I had fallen back into the hospital. My body ached from the impact, and every breath felt heavy. The room around me was unfamiliar, darker and more confined than the others. A trail of blood on the floor led toward a nearby room. Inside, I found a message written directly on the wall in thick, dark streaks. Someone had used blood to write a number large enough to be read from across the room. Whoever had done it must have wanted that number to be seen. I memorized it before leaving the room again. Following the corridor eventually brought me to another patient room. In the center stood a strange locked box resting on a medical bed. Words had been written on the wall behind it, a message promising eternal care, eternal devotion. The box itself was sealed with multiple locks and mechanisms, as if whoever sealed it had been determined to keep it closed forever. One by one, I unlocked each of them. When the final lock opened, I reached inside expecting to find something important. Something that explained all the effort it had taken to protect it. Instead, my hand closed around something small and soft, a single lock of hair. I stared at it for a long moment, confused and frustrated. All that effort for something so fragile and meaningless. Later, in one of the hospital shower rooms, I noticed something glinting deep inside a drain. A key had fallen into the narrow opening where my fingers couldn't reach. After some effort, I managed to retrieve it using the bent needle and the strand of hair as an improvised hook. It felt strange how something so trivial had suddenly become useful. Eventually, I found the elevator and used the key to activate it. The machinery groaned as it carried me down to another section of the hospital that had previously been inaccessible. The corridors here felt even more oppressive than the ones above. It didn't take long before I heard a familiar voice echoing from one of the rooms. Laura. She was sitting on the floor surrounded by stuffed animals, playing quietly as if she were anywhere but a nightmare-filled hospital in Silent Hill. When I confronted her about Mary, she finally told me something important. She said she had known Mary. They had met in the hospital the previous year. According to Laura, they had even become friends. The words made no sense. Mary had died 3 years ago. Before I could question her further, Laura suddenly remembered something. She said she had a letter from Mary that she wanted to give me. She led me into another examination room and pointed toward the far side of the dark space. I stepped forward, searching for the letter. The door slammed shut behind me. Laura had locked me inside. At first, the room was completely silent. Then I realized I wasn't alone. Above me, something moved across the ceiling. 2 grotesque creatures hung there like swollen parasites, their bodies suspended from the ceiling by thick flesh. They began lowering themselves toward me slowly, their limbs twitching as if eager to wrap around my throat. The fight that followed was desperate and chaotic inside the cramped room. The creatures lunged and kicked with violent force, trying to trap me beneath them. I had no choice but to fight back, dodging their attacks while trying to bring them down one by one. Eventually, the final creature collapsed, and the room fell silent again. I stood there breathing heavily, the echo of the battle still ringing in my ears. Somewhere beyond the locked door, Silent Hill continued waiting. After the fight, the hospital changed. It didn't happen slowly, and it didn't happen in a way I could explain. One moment I was inside Brookhaven as I had known it, and the next, it felt as though the building had shed its skin and revealed something underneath. Something darker, more diseased. The halls were still familiar, but only in the same way a nightmare can resemble a memory. The layout was almost the same, yet everything felt wrong. The walls looked more decayed, the air heavier, the silence more oppressive. It was as if the hospital had crossed some invisible line and dragged me with it. I found myself in a small garden area enclosed by metal and shadow, much smaller than it should have been, like the space itself had been compressed. I stood there for a moment, trying to steady my breathing. The battle had drained me, but what frightened me more was the feeling that the hospital was no longer simply a place. It felt alive now, hostile, watching. I moved through the corridor and made my way back into the patient wing, drawn deeper into the building because there was nowhere else to go. The elevator became my only clear path forward, the one remaining thread in a place that seemed determined to confuse and trap me. On the second floor, the nurses were still there, wandering like broken memories in white uniforms. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, their bodies swaying with an eerie imbalance, as if pain itself had learned how to walk. I avoided them where I could and searched the rooms, feeling more and more like I was following a trail left for me by someone who knew exactly where I would step. In one of the rooms, hidden behind torn wallpaper and strange marks on the wall, I found a battery and a key to a storage room in the basement. Nearby was a memo, written with the desperation of someone who had been trapped in darkness too long. It spoke of a place beneath the basement, a smaller and blacker place, and of a ring lost there. A ring. Even before I understood why, the word stayed with me. By then I had learned that in Silent Hill, the smallest objects often carried the greatest weight. I took the key and continued on, reaching the third floor again. Near the elevator, I noticed a door unlike the others, marked by the image of a woman whose arms seemed to extend outward in a warped illusion. The door felt important immediately, though I had no way of opening it yet. There was another note nearby that described her as a kind of angel, a guardian that only one person could truly see, a woman whose bridge could not be crossed by the guilty because she would devour both their sins and the sinners themselves. The words sounded less like poetry and more like a warning. I checked the room where Maria had been resting and found it empty. The sight of the vacant bed filled me with unease that I couldn't quite put into words. A few minutes earlier, her presence had felt almost impossible, like some echo of Mary given flesh and voice. Now she was simply gone. That frightened me more than I wanted to admit. I made my way to the main staircase and descended toward the basement. The lower I went, the more the hospital seemed to close in around me. In the storage room, I found an overturned cabinet marked with smeared handprints. Something had been hidden behind it. When I pushed the cabinet aside, a secret stairway revealed itself, descending into the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow light whole. Before I could go down, Maria appeared behind me. Her voice was hurt, angry, trembling with something deeper than fear. She asked how I could have left her alone in a place like this. She accused me of caring only about Mary, of chasing after a dead wife, while ignoring the person still standing in front of me. There was pain in her words and guilt in the silence that followed. Then, softer now, she asked me not to leave her alone again. I didn't know what to say. I only knew that I didn't want to hear that kind of fear in her voice again. Together, we descended the hidden stairs. At the bottom, lying abandoned in the darkness, I found the ring mentioned in the note. Copper. Cold. Heavy. Stained by the place it had been left in. We returned upstairs with it, and I could feel Maria close beside me, as if she were trying to stay near enough to make sure I wouldn't disappear again. When we stepped into the elevator, the descent was interrupted by a voice crackling through the speaker above us. At first, it sounded like another fragment of the town's madness, some random broadcast leaking into the silence. But then the voice said my name. James Sunderland. Hearing it spoken so casually in that place made my blood run cold. The voice launched into a strange quiz show, asking questions about Silent Hill, as though the whole thing were some grotesque game. I listened, because I had no choice. In this town, even nonsense often turned out to matter. On the second floor, Maria helped me open a fallen refrigerator in the day room, and inside I found a second ring, this one made of lead. 2 rings now. 2 pieces meant for the woman painted on the door upstairs. We returned to the 3rd floor, and before facing that door again, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something terrible was waiting just beyond the next step. I placed the copper and lead rings into the hands of the painted woman, and the door opened. It felt less like unlocking something and more like being allowed to proceed. Beyond it stretched a long, downward staircase leading into darkness. I descended with Maria beside me. Each step seemed to take us farther from the hospital and closer to something else buried beneath it. A discarded note lay on the stairs, mentioning a key. But by then, I had stopped believing the building left things behind by accident. I barely had time to process it before I heard the sound behind us. That scraping, metallic sound I had come to dread more than any scream. Pyramid Head. He was there again, and this time there was no room to fight, no space to circle, no place to hide. Only a long, narrow corridor and the desperate need to run. Maria ran with me, and I could hear him coming after us, relentless, the sound of metal dragging across the floor like an executioner sharpening time itself. I wanted to turn back, to slow him down, to protect her. But fear had stripped everything down to instinct. Forward. Only forward. The corridor seemed endless. Every second felt like a punishment. Then the elevator came into view at the far end like the last promise left in the world. I reached it and turned, waiting for Maria to make it too. But she didn't. The doors closed between us. And then I heard it. A violent sound, wet and final, like flesh being pierced. I couldn't see clearly. I didn't need to. The horror of it landed before the understanding did. Maria was gone. Or at least, that was what the sound wanted me to believe. The elevator carried me away while I stood there, helpless, trapped with the echo of her death. By the time it stopped, I felt hollow, numb. It brought me to a section of the hospital I hadn't reached before, near the lobby. The building was quieter here, almost respectfully so, as if it knew what had just happened and was giving me time to absorb it. The front doors were still locked. The only room open to me was the director's office. Inside, I found a map and a note indicating 2 things hidden outside on Lindsay Street: a letter and a wrench. The note suggested they were important, enough that I marked their location on my own map without hesitation. I also found the key to the hospital lobby. It felt strange to be handed a way out now, after everything the hospital had taken from me. I left the office and walked toward the main entrance. The lobby looked the same as before, but I didn't. I unlocked the door and stepped back out into the fog of Silent Hill, carrying more questions than answers, and the sound of Maria's last moments still haunting every step. When I stepped outside Brookhaven Hospital, the world felt heavier than before. The fog still covered Silent Hill, but the darkness had deepened. The town looked the same streets, the same buildings, the same quiet shapes swallowed by mist, yet everything felt changed. It was as if the city itself had become more hostile, more aware of me. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what had happened inside the hospital. Maria was gone. The sound of Pyramid Head's weapon piercing her still echoed in my head. I wanted to believe I had imagined it. I wanted to believe she had somehow escaped. But the silence left behind made that hope feel impossible. The guilt lingered in my chest, but I forced myself to keep moving. I hadn't come this far to stop now. Mary was still somewhere in this town. That belief was the only thing keeping me on my feet. The streets of Silent Hill had grown darker, the dim light from distant lamps barely cutting through the fog. Shapes moved slowly in the distance. Some of them looked like the same nurses I had encountered inside the hospital. Others resembled the twisted mannequins that seemed to haunt the town. But the streets were wide, and the fog thick enough that I could avoid most of them if I stayed alert. I moved north along Carroll Street, the sound of my footsteps echoing faintly against the empty buildings. The silence between each step made the town feel hollow, like it had been abandoned long ago, but had never truly died. Eventually, I turned south again and wandered through nearby streets, exploring what little remained of the town's quiet corners. The deeper I walked, the more Silent Hill revealed itself as a place that had once been alive. Cars sat abandoned along the sidewalks, their doors closed, their windows fogged with dust. Streetlights flickered weakly above intersections where no one stood waiting. It felt less like a city and more like a memory slowly decaying. As I passed through the streets, I noticed strange creatures moving beneath a metal walkway below me, their long arms stretched upward from the darkness beneath the ground, as if they were trying to reach the world above. They moved slowly, crawling along the underside of the structure like parasites clinging to the bones of the town. Watching them made my skin crawl. I continued east until I reached the southeastern part of Silent Hill again. The trailer I had once passed earlier was still there, silent and lonely beside the road. A small piece of paper inside mentioned Neely's bar as a meeting place. The message was vague, but in a town like this, even vague clues felt important. I kept moving through the streets until I reached the bar itself. The interior was empty. Dust coated the counters, and the air smelled stale and forgotten. But something on the wall immediately caught my attention. Written in dark, smeared letters was a message addressed directly to me. If you want to see Mary, you must die. But you might not end up in the same place as her, James. I stared at the words for a long time. Whoever had written them knew my name. They knew about Mary. That alone made the message impossible to ignore. But the words themselves felt like something meant to push me deeper into despair. I stepped back outside and continued through the fog, trying to shake the feeling that the town itself was speaking to me. Eventually, I reached a small house along Lindsay Street. Something about the place drew my attention immediately. As I approached, I found two objects lying nearby, as if someone had left them intentionally: a letter and a wrench. I unfolded the letter carefully and read it beneath the weak light of the fog-covered street. The message described a hidden key buried near a statue of a praying woman inside Rosewater Park. According to the letter, the key had been sealed inside a metal box that could only be opened with a wrench. I looked down at the tool in my hand and felt a strange sense of inevitability. Whoever had written this letter wanted someone to find that key. And now it seemed I was the one meant to follow the trail. I folded the letter and slipped it into my pocket before making my way back toward the western part of Silent Hill. The fog thickened again as I walked along Cat Street, the quiet of the city broken only by distant, unnatural sounds, echoing somewhere beyond the buildings. Eventually, the road opened toward Rosewater Park once more, the same place where I had met Maria not long ago. That memory returned sharply as I stepped inside. Just hours earlier, she had been standing there, smiling at me with Mary's face. Now she was gone. I tried not to think about it. Instead, I focused on the statue described in the letter. After crossing one of the park's wooden bridges, I finally saw it. A statue of a woman kneeling in prayer. The stone figure stood silently among the fog, her head bowed as if mourning something lost long ago. I walked behind the statue and noticed the ground had been disturbed recently. The sand looked freshly moved, as if someone had dug there not long before I arrived. I knelt down and began digging carefully. My hands eventually struck metal. Beneath the sand was a small metal box secured tightly with bolts. I finally understood why the wrench had been left for me. Using the tool, I loosened the bolts one by one until the lid came free. Inside the box lay an old bronze key. Cold. Heavy. Another piece of the puzzle Silent Hill kept placing in my path. According to the letter, this key would open the doors of the Historical Society building along Nathan Avenue. I closed the box and stood up slowly, staring out across the fog-covered park. Somewhere ahead of me was the museum, and beyond that, maybe the truth behind everything that had brought me to Silent Hill. I slipped the bronze key into my pocket and began walking west along Nathan Avenue, the fog swallowing the park behind me as I moved toward the next place the town seemed determined to lead me. Inside the Silent Hill Historical Society building, the air felt older than the rest of the town. Dust hung in the silence like a memory that refused to disappear. Just beyond the entrance stood a small counter where a faint red mark had been left behind, the kind of symbol that seemed to appear everywhere in Silent Hill. I paused there for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me. The building felt abandoned, but not empty. There was always that same feeling in this town, as if something unseen was watching from somewhere just beyond sight. I moved deeper into the museum and entered the next room. Paintings lined the walls, their subjects long forgotten by anyone who might have once admired them. One of them immediately caught my attention. The painting depicted the towering figure I had encountered more than once already. The man with the triangular helmet. Pyramid Head. Seeing him portrayed in a painting inside this museum sent a chill down my spine. It suggested something I didn't want to consider. That the creature wasn't just some random horror wandering the town. That he belonged here, somehow. That Silent Hill had known him long before I arrived. I tried to push the thought aside and continued exploring the museum. Another room displayed glass cases and faded exhibits, remnants of the town's history. But one thing stood out immediately. A massive hole in the wall, large enough for a person to crawl through. From somewhere beyond, it came a strange sound, distant and hollow, like the echo of a horn or some mournful call traveling through the earth itself. It wasn't an inviting path. But Silent Hill had already taught me that the least inviting paths were often the only ones left. I stepped through the hole and entered a long tunnel carved through the darkness. The deeper I walked, the more the air felt cold and damp, as if the museum above was only a thin layer covering something buried far below the town. The tunnel eventually ended at a door. On the other side was another room, equally abandoned. The quiet there was almost suffocating. After gathering my bearings, I continued through the only door available. The corridors beyond were darker, the walls rougher, less like part of a museum, and more like the hidden bones beneath it. One of the twisted creatures staggered toward me from the shadows, its body wrapped and distorted, like the ones I had encountered before. I forced myself to keep moving forward, deeper through the passages. Eventually, the corridor ended in a place that made my stomach tighten. A well. The circular pit sat silently in the center of the room. I approached carefully and leaned over the edge, shining my flashlight downward. The beam vanished into darkness before reaching the bottom. Whatever lay below was hidden far beyond the light. There was no ladder, no rope, no clear path down. But there was also no other way forward. For a moment I stood there, staring into the darkness, wondering how many other people had stood in this same spot before me, faced with the same impossible choice. Then I stepped over the edge and jumped. The fall felt longer than it should have been, the darkness swallowing the light above me. When I finally hit the ground, the impact sent a sharp shock through my body. But somehow I was still standing. I looked around. The well was deeper than it had seemed from above, and the walls around me were made of old brick, damp and worn with age. But there was no exit, no ladder leading back up, no door, just stone. The distant sound I had heard earlier still echoed faintly through the walls. That meant there had to be another passage somewhere nearby. I began examining the bricks carefully. Most of them were solid and unmoving, but eventually my hand brushed against one that felt different, looser than the others. I stepped back and struck the wall with the metal pipe I had been carrying. The brick cracked. Another strike shattered it completely, revealing a hidden opening behind the wall. Beyond it waited another door. The deeper I went, the more the place felt less like a museum and more like a buried labyrinth beneath Silent Hill itself. The corridors twisted through the underground structure like veins, each turn revealing more darkness. In one of the rooms, I found something small lying on a surface near the back, a key. The moment I picked it up, the light from my flashlight suddenly died, plunging the room into darkness. For a second, panic threatened to take over. Then I remembered the battery I had found earlier in the hospital. After replacing it, the beam flickered back to life. And that was when I saw them. The floor, the walls, the ceiling, crawling with insects, creepers, dozens of them. They moved slowly at first, their bodies shifting in the light like a living carpet of black shapes. If they all rushed me at once, I wouldn't stand a chance. I tried the door behind me, locked. Beside it was a keypad. Some of the buttons were worn down more than others, their surfaces lighter from repeated use. That had to be the clue. Whoever had used this door before had pressed those numbers many times. My hands moved quickly across the keypad, testing the combinations one by one while the creatures crept closer. Each wrong attempt triggered movement behind me, the insects stirring like a swarm preparing to descend. Finally, the correct sequence clicked. The door unlocked. I rushed through it without looking back. Ahead of me was a heavy metal gate set into the floor itself. The key I had found fit perfectly into the lock. The mechanism turned with a deep metallic sound. When the gate finally opened, I stared down into the darkness beyond. The museum had only been the surface. What waited below was something else entirely. Toluca Prison. When I stepped into the prison, the air changed immediately. It felt colder, heavier, as if the walls themselves remembered everything that had happened there. The room I entered looked like an old dining hall, rows of tables stretching across the space beneath dim, lifeless lights. Eddie was there. He stood near one of the tables, staring down at a body slumped over the surface. Something about him had changed. The nervousness I had seen before was still there, but now it was mixed with something darker. He told me he had killed the man at the table because he had no choice. Then he laughed it off like a joke, saying the man had already been dead when he arrived. I didn't know which version of the story was true. But the way Eddie spoke, the way his voice trembled between fear and anger, made it clear that something inside him was breaking. He didn't stay long. After a few uneasy words, he walked away through one of the doors, leaving me alone with the corpse and the silence of the prison. I looked around the room and found a strange stone tablet resting nearby, carved with the image of a grotesque pig devouring everything before it. The symbol felt disturbing, but I took it anyway. Something about this place suggested that objects like these were meant to be used somewhere deeper inside the prison. I followed the path Eddie had taken, moving through the corridors beyond the dining hall. The prison stretched out in cold stone hallways and rusted bars. It felt endless. Somewhere nearby, the distorted shapes of those creatures wandered through the darkness, their movements echoing through the empty corridors. Eventually, I found a map of the prison resting on a table near one of the barred walkways. Studying it briefly gave me some sense of direction, though the building still felt like a maze designed to trap anyone foolish enough to enter. One of the hallways led into a locker area, where the damp smell of old water lingered in the air. At the far end of the showers, lying abandoned on the floor, I found another tablet. This one bore the figure of a woman whose form seemed to represent temptation itself. The imagery was disturbing, but by now I had learned not to question the symbol Silent Hill placed before me. I returned to the corridors and continued deeper into the prison until I reached a section of cell blocks. Some of the cells stood open, while others remained sealed behind rusted bars. Inside many of them, the twisted creatures moved restlessly, trapped like animals, but still capable of lashing out if I came too close. The sight made the prison feel less like a place meant to hold criminals, and more like a cage for nightmares. In one of the open cells, I found something unexpected: a wax doll. Its blank expression and pale surface made it look disturbingly lifelike in the dim light. I couldn't explain why, but instinct told me it would matter later. Continuing through the prison eventually brought me into a wide-open courtyard surrounded by high walls. In the center stood a strange wooden structure that immediately reminded me of a gallows. 3 empty spaces had been carved into the frame, clearly meant to hold something. I already had 2 tablets. That meant there had to be a third somewhere nearby. I searched the remaining cell block until I found it resting inside one of the empty cells. The final tablet depicted a figure of authority, an oppressor looming over others. When I carried the 3 tablets back to the courtyard and placed them into the structure, the air suddenly changed. For a moment, everything went completely silent. Then the stillness shattered with a horrible sound. A scream cut through the prison, followed by the unmistakable creak of a rope tightening under weight. The sound of an execution echoed across the courtyard, even though there was no one there. Only then did I fully understand what the structure had been used for. The gallows had once been part of the prison's executions. After the sound faded, I turned toward the exit again, unsure whether anything had truly changed. But when I reached the door, something new hung from the handle: a horseshoe. The moment I saw it, I remembered the faint sounds I had heard earlier, like distant hooves moving somewhere through the prison's darkness. Who had placed it there, or why, remained another mystery the town refused to answer. I carried the horseshoe with me as I continued exploring the prison's corridors. Eventually, I entered a room filled with scattered equipment and broken furniture. On a counter, I spotted a lighter resting just out of reach. Finding a way around the clutter allowed me to retrieve it, and I slipped it into my pocket. In another office nearby, I discovered something that finally explained why the prison had been built in this place. A document spoke about Toluca Lake and the strange history surrounding it. Decades earlier, a ship called the Little Baroness had vanished in the fog while crossing the lake. Not a single piece of wreckage had ever been found. The story ended with a chilling detail. Many bodies now rested at the bottom of the lake, their skeletal hands reaching upward toward any boats that passed above them. The deeper I went through the prison, the more Silent Hill seemed to reveal fragments of its past, each story darker than the last. In one of the final rooms, I found a hunting rifle secured inside a cabinet. The weapon felt powerful in my hands, though I sensed it would only be necessary for something far worse waiting ahead. Eventually, I reached a heavy metal trapdoor set into the floor. It looked like the only way forward, but the handle needed to open. It was missing. After a moment, I realized the objects I had collected could work together. The wax doll, the horseshoe, and the lighter, combined into a crude but functional handle. Using the improvised tool, I pulled the trapdoor open and stared down into the darkness beneath the prison. Once again, the only path forward led downward. I dropped into the opening. Below, the prison gave way to something even worse. A foul-smelling room filled with decaying bodies stretched out before me like a forgotten morgue. I moved through it quickly, refusing to look too closely at the shapes lying across the tables. Another door led deeper underground. Then, another drop. Another corridor. It felt like descending through layers of the town itself. Eventually, I reached a large elevator waiting silently in the darkness. When I stepped inside, the doors closed automatically, and the machine began descending without any input from me. The ride felt long, the mechanical hum echoing through the empty shaft. When the elevator finally stopped, the doors opened slowly. A small save point stood nearby, glowing faintly in the darkness, like a final warning. Beyond the door ahead lay the next place Silent Hill wanted me to go. The labyrinth. When the elevator finally stopped and the doors opened, I stepped into another nightmare. The air underground felt thick and damp, and the space ahead twisted into narrow corridors that stretched in every direction. It felt like a maze built not just from stone, but from confusion itself. There was no map, no signs, just dim walls, rusted pipes, and darkness swallowing every corner the flashlight couldn't reach. At the far end of the first corridor, I discovered why I couldn't continue forward. A barricade of tangled wires blocked the path completely. Whoever built this place had sealed the way deliberately. If I wanted to move deeper, I would have to find something capable of cutting through the wires. I turned and started exploring the maze. The deeper I walked, the more the labyrinth felt alive, as if it were shifting around me. The corridors twisted in ways that made it impossible to trust my sense of direction. Every turn looked like the last one. Every stairwell seemed to lead somewhere unfamiliar. Somewhere along the maze, I came across something unsettling. A massive blade rested on a table stained with old blood. It was impossibly large, heavy enough that no ordinary person should be able to wield it. I immediately recognized it. It belonged to him. Pyramid Head. The weapon radiated a presence as disturbing as its owner, as if the violence tied to it had soaked into the metal itself. I left it behind. Carrying something like that felt wrong. Instead, I kept moving through the maze, eventually finding a ladder leading downward into another section. The tunnels continued beneath the first level, even more claustrophobic than before. After climbing back up through another ladder, I entered a small chamber, where a strange object stood at the center of the room. It was a cube, but each side of it displayed a different face. Some stared forward with hollow expressions, others twisted upside down or sideways. When I rotated the cube, something unexpected happened. The structure of the adjacent room shifted, as if the cube controlled the architecture itself. Walls moved, passages opened and closed. The labyrinth was rearranging itself depending on which face I chose. After adjusting the cube enough times, a passage finally aligned properly. I descended the ladder into the newly opened area and froze in disbelief. Behind a set of bars, sitting quietly inside a cell, was Maria. Alive. For a moment, I couldn't even speak. I had watched Pyramid Head kill her. I had heard the sound of the spear piercing her body. There had been no doubt in my mind that she was gone. Yet here she was, completely unharmed. She spoke to me with a strange calmness, even mentioning things only Mary should have known. The familiarity in her voice made my thoughts spin. Was she Maria, or Mary, or something else entirely? I left the cell area and climbed back toward the room with the cube. As I entered the chamber again, I heard the sound of electrical sparks crackling nearby. A panel on the wall had been damaged, its wires exposed and severed. Someone had cut through them recently. Eddie? Pyramid Head? I had no way of knowing. But lying beside the broken panel was exactly what I needed. Wire cutters. Finally, I had the tool necessary to break through the barricade at the start of the labyrinth. I retraced my steps through the maze until I reached the tangled wall of wires again. With the cutters in hand, the obstruction was quickly removed, revealing another ladder descending deeper underground. The tunnels below were partially flooded, forcing me to wade through cold water that reflected the weak beam of my flashlight. The labyrinth seemed determined to drag me further and further downward. Eventually, the corridors led me to a door that opened into a dim room where someone stood waiting. Angela. She looked terrified, her entire body trembling as if something unseen surrounded her. Before I could ask what was wrong, the air shifted violently. A grotesque shape began forming nearby, something that looked less like a creature and more like a twisted piece of furniture dragged across the floor by invisible limbs. The thing moved with horrifying strength, slamming itself toward me with sudden bursts of movement. The fight that followed was brutal and desperate. The room was cramped, leaving little space to avoid the creature's attacks. Each blast from the shotgun echoed through the walls as the monster lurched closer and closer. Eventually, the creature collapsed, its twisted form finally going still. When the danger passed, Angela approached the corpse in a frenzy of rage and grief. She stabbed it again and again, screaming through tears. Watching her, I began to understand the truth. The monster had been her father, the man who had abused her for years. The newspaper article I had found earlier suddenly made sense. Angela had killed him. That knife she carried, it had been the weapon. The weight of her pain filled the room even after the creature was gone. Angela eventually walked away, disappearing deeper into the labyrinth, while the silence returned once again. Further along the maze, I discovered a disturbing chamber. Several bodies hung suspended from ropes, each marked with a sign describing the crime they had supposedly committed. 17 steps away stood another room containing the ropes themselves, each connected to the bodies above. One of the condemned had been innocent. Whoever that person was held the key I needed to continue. By reading the message left behind and piecing together the clues, I realized the innocent prisoner had been falsely accused. When I pulled the correct rope, the corresponding body vanished, leaving behind a key. The key of the persecuted. With the key in hand, I unlocked a gate further down the corridor and descended another staircase. The air grew colder the deeper I went. At the bottom, I found a quiet hospital room hidden within the labyrinth. Maria lay on the bed, completely motionless. This time, she really looked dead. I stood there for a long moment, staring at her lifeless body. The first time I had cried. Now there was nothing left. No shock, no grief, just a strange emptiness. I turned away and left the room. Beyond the corridor, I reached a grim courtyard filled with open graves. 3 of them had been prepared. One marked Angela. One marked Eddie. The third bore my own name. My grave was deeper than the others. When I leaned closer, I realized it wasn't just a grave. It was another passage leading downward. Silent Hill was calling me deeper again. I jumped into the darkness. After climbing down another ladder and walking through a long corridor, I entered a cold storage room filled with hanging slabs of meat. Eddie stood there waiting for me. Another body lay nearby. He had killed again. The fear and insecurity I had seen in him before were gone. In their place was rage. Eddie believed everyone laughed at him. Everyone judged him. Everyone deserved to die for it. When I told him he needed help, something inside him snapped completely. The gun in his hand turned toward me. The fight with Eddie was chaotic and brutal. At first, he tried to overpower me with close attacks, but eventually he fled deeper into the freezing room filled with hanging carcasses. The cold air turned the space into a foggy maze of its own. Eddie hid between the meat hooks, firing from unexpected angles. The sound of gunshots echoed through the freezer as I struggled to track him through the haze. Eventually, the fight ended. Eddie collapsed onto the floor, defeated. As the life faded from his eyes, the room fell silent again. Another person broken by Silent Hill. Another tragedy this town had consumed. And somehow, I knew the worst parts of my journey were still waiting ahead. After Eddie died, I didn't feel victorious. I just felt empty. Until then, every horror in Silent Hill had been something twisted, something unreal, something I could separate from the world I used to know. But Eddie had been human, frightened, broken, angry, confused. Human. Even if he had forced my hand, even if there had been no other way, the weight of it stayed with me. For a while, I just stood there in the cold, listening to the silence settle over the room he would never leave. Then I forced myself to move. Mary was still the reason I had come this far. If I stopped now, then all of it, every step, through fog and blood and darkness, would mean nothing. I made my way toward the pier at Toluca Lake. The air outside was colder than ever, and the fog stretched across the water like a second world. At the end of the dock, a small boat waited in the stillness, as if it had been left there for me alone. I climbed in without thinking too hard about it. Out on the lake, there was no road, no signpost, no human voice. Only fog, water, and the distant glow of a single light somewhere far ahead. I fixed my eyes on that light and kept rowing toward it. It felt less like traveling across a lake and more like crossing into something final. Eventually, the outline of another pier emerged from the mist. Beyond it stood the Lakeview Hotel. I had reached the place Mary and I had once shared, the place memory had preserved as gentle and warm and bright. Standing there again, I felt something close to hope. If Mary was anywhere, maybe she was here. As I approached the hotel grounds, I found a music box near a fountain on the left side of the courtyard. Its presence felt oddly deliberate, like another piece of a story being arranged in front of me. Inside the hotel, I found a guest map near the entrance, and on it was a message telling me someone was waiting for me in room 312 on the 3rd floor. My chest tightened the moment I saw the number. That had been our room. Mine and Mary's. 3 years ago, before illness and bitterness and suffering had swallowed everything between us, we had stayed there together. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to believe I might truly be close to her. The hotel was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. It carried the same strange stillness as the rest of Silent Hill, as if the building were holding its breath. I explored the rooms and halls, gathering pieces of the path ahead without really understanding yet how they fit together. In the restaurant, I found Laura. She was sitting at the piano, and for once, she didn't seem like the same sharp, difficult child who had taunted me and run from me again and again. There was something softer in her voice now, something honest. She told me she had been looking for Mary too. Then she gave me a letter. Mary's letter to Laura. I read it slowly, and each word seemed to press deeper into me than the last. Mary wrote to Laura with warmth, affection, tenderness. She told her she loved her like a daughter. She wished things had been different. She wished she could have adopted her. And then came the detail that shook me more than anything else in that moment. The letter was for Laura's 8th birthday, and Laura said she had turned 8 only weeks ago. That made no sense. Mary had died 3 years earlier. If this letter was real, then the truth I had been carrying all this time no longer fit together. The room seemed to tilt around me. Either Mary had lived longer than I believed, or I had been wrong about everything. Laura left after that, but her words stayed behind. The letter stayed behind, and with them came a terrible, impossible hope. Maybe Mary really was here. Maybe this whole nightmare still had an answer I could bear. In the reception area, I found a note telling me that a videotape I had left behind during my stay years ago was being kept in an office on the 2nd floor. I also found the key to room 312. Holding it in my hand felt strangely intimate, like touching a piece of my own buried past. I continued through the hotel, opening locked rooms, following clues, uncovering more of the strange logic Silent Hill had laid out for me. Some of it felt almost theatrical, like the building was asking me to perform a sequence of actions before it would allow me to reach the truth. I found more music boxes, more keys, more signs that the hotel wanted me to see something in a certain order. At one point, I had to leave behind all of my weapons and supplies to use a service elevator that would only carry the weight of a single person. Standing there without any of the tools that had kept me alive until then, I felt stripped down to something vulnerable and human again. All I had left on me were Mary's photo and her letter. Somehow, that felt appropriate, as if the hotel were forcing me to understand that none of the weapons mattered anymore. Not here. Not at the end. I moved through the staff areas and the dark lower floors of the building, through boiler rooms and kitchens and service halls, collecting the last few things I needed. The hotel became stranger the deeper I went, less like a real place, and more like a memory being peeled open. When I finally recovered my belongings and returned to the main lobby, I found the large music box puzzle waiting in the center of the room. 3 small music boxes, each tied to a fairy tale, each meant to be placed in its proper position. It felt absurd on the surface, almost childish, but Silent Hill had never used innocence without corrupting it somehow. Once I arranged them correctly, the large music box finally played its melody, and in doing so, revealed the key that would let me reach the 3rd floor. At last, there was nothing left between me and room 312. I climbed the stairs with my heart pounding harder with every step. The halls of the 3rd floor were quiet, unbearably quiet, as if the hotel itself knew what waited in that room. When I unlocked the door to 312 and stepped inside, the room looked empty. No Mary. No figure waiting in the half-light. Only a television and a video cassette recorder. The tape I had come all this way to find. I stood there for a long moment before placing it into the machine. Part of me already knew that whatever was on that tape would change everything. But I still pressed play. The images that appeared on the screen were not memories I had forgotten. They were memories I had buried. In that room, in front of that flickering television, the truth finally rose to the surface. Mary had not simply died. I had killed her. I had ended her suffering with my own hands, pressing a pillow over her face until she stopped breathing. Whether I told myself it was mercy, whether I told myself it was love, whether some part of me had wanted freedom from the pain of watching her fade away, none of it changed what I had done. I had come to Silent Hill searching for my dead wife, clinging to a letter from the woman I claimed to love, while the truth had been waiting here the entire time. Not somewhere in the fog, not hidden in the town, hidden in me. When Laura arrived and I told her the truth, the look in her eyes changed instantly. Whatever small chance there had been for her to see me as Mary had seen me disappeared in that moment. She said she hated me. Then she ran. I couldn't even blame her. I barely had the strength to keep standing myself. And as the truth settled over me, the illusion of the hotel began to fall away. The beautiful, warm Lakeview Hotel I had been walking through revealed its real form at last. Rotting. Burned. Ruined. The place around me had been decaying all along, and only now was I seeing it clearly. Just like Mary. Just like myself. After the truth came crashing down in room 312, the Lakeview Hotel began to change before my eyes. The warm, elegant place I had clung to in my memory slowly fell apart, revealing something rotten beneath it. The wallpaper looked sickly. The halls felt colder. The silence no longer resembled nostalgia. It felt like judgment. Whatever version of this hotel I had been walking through before, it was gone now. All that remained was the real place, or maybe the truest one, a place shaped by guilt, grief, and everything I had refused to remember. I stepped out into the corridor feeling hollow, but there was no turning back anymore. The truth was no longer something hiding in the dark. It was walking beside me now. On the second floor, the eastern side of the building had become unreachable by ordinary means, as if the hotel itself were forcing me to take a stranger path. In one of the rooms, I found something impossible. I entered one doorway and emerged somewhere else entirely, as though the architecture had stopped obeying reason. By passing through room 202, I found myself on the eastern side near room 209. At that point, I no longer questioned how any of it worked. Silent Hill had long since abandoned any obligation to make sense. I moved deeper into the hotel, descending through the elevator into the flooded lower levels. Water covered the floor up to my knees, and every step sent ripples through the darkness. Shapes moved beneath the surface, gliding silently where I could barely see them. It felt as if the hotel were alive under the water, hiding things just out of sight. I made my way into the bar, then through the kitchen and service corridors, following the only path left open to me. Everything smelled damp and ruined. The deeper I went, the less the hotel felt like a building, and the more it felt like a memory drowning in its own decay. Then I found Angela. She stood on the staircase, like a soul already halfway gone. The air around her shimmered with heat, and the stairs above her burned with impossible flames. She was trembling, exhausted, consumed by pain that had followed her all the way to the end. At one point, she asked for her knife back. She wanted to die. I refused. But refusal didn't save her. Nothing I said could reach her anymore. She looked at the fire as though it belonged to her, as though she had been climbing toward it her whole life. Then she began walking upward into the flames. I tried to follow, but the heat became unbearable. The fire only seemed to grow stronger the closer I came, until I had no choice but to stop. I stood there helplessly and watched her disappear into the burning red above. In that moment, I understood something terrible. What I had seen was not just a hallway or a staircase. It was Angela's world, her own private hell. And if Silent Hill had given each of us a world shaped by our sins and suffering, then mine was still waiting for me too. I moved on because there was nothing else I could do. The first floor of the hotel had become another maze of locked doors and distorted spaces, its familiar layout warped by the same cruel logic that had ruled everything else in Silent Hill. Eventually, I reached a long hallway, watched over by grotesque shapes moving below the floor, and at the end of it stood a pair of heavy doors. Beside them, red save marks covered the wall like a final warning. I already knew what that meant. Something waited beyond those doors. Something final. When I stepped through, I found Maria. She was suspended before me, trapped and pleading, alive for only a few more seconds. 2 pyramid heads stood beside her. 2 executioners. 2 versions of the same punishment that had haunted me since I entered this town. I begged them to stop, but my voice meant nothing. They killed her in front of me again, and this time, something inside me finally broke open. Not into despair, into understanding. Maria had never simply been another woman. She was something I had created without knowing it, a distorted answer to Mary, shaped from longing, guilt, desire, and denial. And Pyramid Head, he had never been some random monster roaming Silent Hill. He had belonged to me. He had existed for one reason only, to punish me, to kill the illusion again and again, until I could no longer avoid what I had done. Everything I had seen in Silent Hill, every horror, every cruelty, every impossible thing, had been part of the same punishment. My punishment. But by then, I was done running from it. Done letting those things decide what I deserved. I confronted the two pyramid heads in a vast room where there was nowhere left to hide from myself. The battle was violent, but it no longer felt like a struggle for survival alone. It felt like an act of refusal, a final decision that I would stop letting my guilt control me. Eventually, both creatures staggered to the center of the room and, without my hand forcing them, drove their own spears into themselves. It was as if they understood they were no longer needed. When they fell, they left behind 2 eggs, scarlet and rust-colored, symbols as strange and ceremonial as everything else Silent Hill had placed before me. I used them to open the final path. Beyond it was a long corridor that seemed to stretch forever. As I walked, I heard voices. Mine and Mary's. A conversation from the tape, from the past, from a time I had spent years trying not to truly face. The hallway forced me to listen. There was no other purpose to it. Every step was another memory, another wound reopened. By the time I reached the staircase at the end, I felt stripped bare. At the top, I found Mary, or something wearing her face. Sometimes she seemed to lie in bed, like the dying woman I remembered. Sometimes she stood by the window, as if she had been waiting there all along, watching the rain. She looked like the last memory of my wife, and the last lie I needed to destroy. I knew then that this was not really Mary, not the woman I had loved, hurt, resented, pitied, and finally killed. This was what remained of all the pain between us, all the bitterness, all the sorrow, all the things that had grown so unbearable in the final days of her life that I had chosen to end them with my own hands. The creature that confronted me was not just a monster. It was the shape of everything unresolved between us. And so the final battle began. She attacked from a distance, surrounding herself with darkness and sickness, sending swarms and tendrils of hatred toward me. But the truth was already stronger than fear now. The fight was not only about staying alive, it was about ending the nightmare for good. Every step, every shot, every moment I kept moving was a refusal to remain trapped in the same lie. Eventually she weakened. The figure before me faltered and fell. And in that moment, I understood that the battle had never truly been against her. It had been against the part of myself that wanted to keep sleeping inside denial forever. I approached her slowly. The nightmare was ending. Whatever came next, whatever judgment or peace or emptiness waited beyond Silent Hill, I knew one thing at last. I was awake. After everything that happened in the hotel, after the truth finally surfaced, and the last illusion fell away, there was nothing left to hide from. The silence that followed Mary's final words was heavier than anything Silent Hill had shown me before. For a long time, I stood there, staring at her, trying to understand how love, pain, guilt, and mercy could twist together into something so terrible. I had spent the entire journey searching for Mary. But in the end, what I had really been searching for was forgiveness. When I finally left that room, the world outside the hotel felt colder than before. The fog hung over Toluca Lake like a curtain that had been waiting patiently for this moment. I walked slowly toward the car waiting near the water. Mary was there with me now, not as the sick woman from those final months, not as the angry voice that had filled our home with bitterness, but as the memory of the person she once was. The Mary who had laughed with me, who had dreamed about the future we would build together, who had believed we could live a quiet and happy life. That Mary was gone, and I was the one who had ended her life. I told myself again and again that it had been mercy, that I had done it because I loved her, that watching her suffer had become unbearable. But the truth was more complicated than that. Somewhere inside me there had also been exhaustion, fear, a selfish desire for the pain to stop. Silent Hill had forced me to face that truth. Every monster, every hallway, every impossible thing I had seen was a reflection of the punishment I believed I deserved. I had come to this town because part of me already knew what I had done. The fog had simply given shape to the guilt I carried. I sat in the driver's seat and looked out across the lake. The water was perfectly still, as if the entire world had paused to watch. Mary's voice echoed faintly in my mind, gentle and tired. She had forgiven me. In her final words, she had told me she still loved me. But even with those words, I couldn't forgive myself. Some wounds do not close simply because someone says it's all right. I thought about the years Mary and I had shared before the illness, the small moments, the quiet happiness, the promises we had made without realizing how fragile they were. Those memories felt distant now, like something that had belonged to someone else's life. I started the engine and slowly drove toward the edge of the lake. The fog thickened around the headlights, swallowing the road ahead. There was no panic in me anymore, no fear, just a strange calm. Silent Hill had given me the truth I came here to find, and now that I understood it, there was only one place left for me to go. The water of Toluca Lake stretched endlessly into the gray mist. Somewhere beneath its surface lay countless lost things, forgotten stories, and silent tragedies. Soon, mine would become one of them. I closed my eyes for a moment and whispered Mary's name. Then I pressed the accelerator. The car rolled forward into the fog, and the lake rose up to meet us.